My fantasy in two movements for solo violin is quite another matter. It was composed in 1958 on commission from Yehudi Menuhin for first performance on his concert, which was to open the American musical events at the International Exposition in Brussels in June 1958. Mr. Menuhin wrote me in early November and expressed a desire to have the work by February 1st so that he could learn it while touring Australia and India. I had little time to relax over the holidays, and the university permitted me some free time. And in early January, my wife and I went to New York City and got us an apartment in that wonderful old Chelsea Hotel on 23rd Street, where I went to work on my electronic piano, which I despise, but which at least can be carried in like a suitcase so nobody knows that you have a piano in your room. I mentioned on an early program the ideas that I had while composing my 7-string quartet. My interest in dividing the 12-tone row into 6-tone hexachords that had a symmetrical relationship and that could be expressed by a source set or an epigrammatic scale order. You will have to bear with me in my struggle to make these ideas intelligible to you. They are, of course, shop talk for the composer and not very easy to communicate to other people. In any case, this concept of serialization began generating all sorts of ideas. During 1957, a work for solo violin began to form in my mind based on the most symmetrical order that one could imagine. Now, the last 6 notes of this row are an inversion of the first 6. But within the halves, that is, within the hexachord, the last 3 notes are also inversions of the first 3. Is an inversion of? Actually, this row is concerned with only one musical situation, that is the relationship of half tone and whole tone. Nevertheless, the way that the row is formed makes the use of all basic intervals except perhaps the diminished fifth, which isn't of much structural value in any case. Each hexachord is compressed within a perfect fourth, and it seemed to me that this compression made possible a wonderful freedom within the hexachord. What difference did it make if the order was this, or this, or this? One recognized the basic form because of the row's great simplicity. I decided to call my work a fantasy. In using that word, I intended to describe a process of 12-tone composition in which a calculated element of freedom or improvisation was introduced. Instead of changing to a permutation of the row for a new movement, I placed at my command a somewhat freer type of permutation, but one limited to the smaller cell of the 6-note hexachord that could be used at any moment as an alternative to the row order. In describing my fantasy in 2 movements for solo violin, I wrote the following in the preface of the published edition brought out by Peters. This work was planned as a panel of 2 movements, each the opposite of the other, yet the 2 making a larger unified whole. The unity comes both from the serial technique employed in the work and from the tonal orientation of the material to D. The contrast of the movements is the result not only of differences of mood, of rhythm, and of formal design, but also of variations and permutations of the original chromatic order, which result in a gradual expansion of the instrumental textures and gestures. I call the first movement statement and variation. The simplest statement of my material is heard at the beginning and the end of this movement. In between are a series of sections in which the process of permutation that I have described takes place. The relationship of the sections is, I think, perfectly clear. The section of greatest complexity is the three-voice fugue in the middle of the movement. The second movement is called development and conclusion. Immediately in this movement, many permutations are presented with fewer references to the original form of the row. This movement is again sectionalized. After a dramatic beginning, it moves through a capricious section to a syncopated rhythmic section. Then suddenly a new permutation is used that crosses the hexachord cells and destroys the symmetry of the row. The result is a slow lyric section that forms the center of the movement. After this section, the music returns. First to the syncopated rhythm, then to the capricious section, and finally to the dramatic beginning, which leads to an ending, and finally to the statement on which the entire work started. The premiere of this work in Brussels was a lot of fun. Mr. Menuhin played it superbly from memory to a brilliant audience that included Queen Elizabeth, and in front of blinding lights that televised the performance all over Europe. There was a lively party after the concert, and the next day Mrs. Finney and I were invited with the Menuhins to lunch with the Queen, who is herself a violinist and is one of the great patronesses of music. Mr. Menuhin explained why he commissioned a work for violin alone. On his tours, he does not take an accompanist from country to country, but picks up the accompanist in the area that he's visiting. The result is that he must play rather standard works. A work for violin alone demands no accompanist, and still it can add a contemporary touch to his recitals. He has commissioned the Sonata for Solo Violin by Bela Bartok and a similar work from Walton. Mr. Menuhin has performed the Fantasy in two movements on his tours. He gave the first American performance in New York City in December of 1959. I heard this performance, and it was one of the most beautiful that he has given. He performed the work in Hill Auditorium in Ann Arbor in the fall of 1961. And the tape that you will hear now is a recording of that performance. You have heard Yehudi Menuhin performing my fantasy in 2 movements for solo violin.